Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 14 of the regular season between the Sharks and the Ducks, in which the Sharks have managed to win 5-0. Wait, no, sorry, actually. I forgot the 2 goals scored by Mario Ferraro were actually for the Ducks and not for the Sharks. So, in fact, they actually only ended up winning 3-2 here tonight. In the first period, this game did not start off very well at all for the Sharks. The first goal was scored within the first minute of this game, technically from Sam Steele, though this one deflects off of both skates of Mario Ferraro before going past Martin Jones. And then the Ducks continue it with multiple other grade A chances, though are unable to get any others past Martin Jones in this period. Luckily for the Sharks, they managed to get one back for themselves in the last couple of minutes of this period, that one coming from John Leonard, his first of his career, and the Sharks end up being tied, luckily for themselves, after 20 minutes. And this kind of reminded me of the point I had made in my Kings review, where if you were in a situation where would you rather be down a couple of goals but having played a really good period, or be, let's say, leading or tied after playing a bad period, you always choose being leading or tied because it gives your team a chance to rebound in the following period in a situation where they're ahead or at the very least even, compared to having your team have to sustain the performance in a game where they are currently trailing. And that's exactly what ends up happening here. After probably their worst first period of this season, considering their other first periods have been really good for the Sharks, they end up putting off their best second period of the season, though I guess it's not saying too much considering their other second periods have been disastrous, with goals from LeBanc and Couture, as well as a strong defensive period to take a 3-1 lead after 40 minutes. In the third period, the Sharks would go into very heavy turtle mode, where they would get basically nothing generated offensively, at least at even strength, but the Ducks would only manage to get one more on the scoreboard, that coming technically from Comtois, though this one deflected off of the stick of Mario Ferraro as well, and the Sharks would hold on to the lead and get their first regulation win since their actual first regulation win of the season against the Minnesota Wild multiple weeks ago. So a key win against a important player in this division, because the Ducks are going to be one of the teams that the Sharks are going to try and beat out for that final playoff spot in this West Division, if we assume the Blues, the Avalanche, and the Golden Knights will take the top 3 spots. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. He's right back between the pipes here tonight. Devan Dubnyk was actually healthy enough to be the backup for this game, though I suspect probably not healthy enough to actually be the starter for this one. And considering this situation, I do suspect Dubnyk will be healthy enough to at least get the start in either Thursday's game against the Blues or Saturday's game against them. But more importantly, focusing on Martin Jones tonight, he puts up a very, very strong game. As I pointed out, yes, there were these couple of goals, though, of course, they ended up deflecting off of Sharks players, so it's kind of hard to blame Martin Jones for that one. But there were multiple other grade A chances, as I said, for the Ducks after this Sam Steele goal, and Jones was huge in being able to stop those. And you can't imagine, we can't even begin to imagine how demoralizing it could have been for the Sharks, where after giving up this own goal to give the Ducks the 1-0 lead, if they managed to score a second or even a third one to take a 2 or 3-0 lead, it could have very well snowballed from there, and the Sharks could have ended up just losing, maybe even getting blown out here tonight. So Martin Jones coming up huge, and actually you could say stealing the game here for the Sharks. And Jones actually ends up outdueling John Gibson, not for the first time this season, but for the second time this season, which is not really something I thought I would be saying coming into this year, because John Gibson is, of course, one of the best goaltenders in the entire NHL. Next, I'll be talking about Fredrik Claesson and Nicholas Milosh's performance in this game. So, of course, with the injuries of both Karlsson and Shemek sustained in the previous game against the Golden Knights, the Sharks were looking for both a 5th and 6th defenseman to fill in those gaps for at least the foreseeable future. Both Karlsson and Shemek's injuries are not expected to be super long-term, so these two players who were coming in only had to be, decent in their roles. They didn't necessarily have to get settled into these positions, because they likely won't find themselves in the lineup for much longer. And both of these players, I would say, did their roles rather admirably. Obviously, there was this disastrous giveaway by Fredrik Claesson behind the net, I believe, in the second period, which ended up with a great chance for Lundestrom in the slot that Jones had to make a huge save on. But otherwise, neither of these defensemen, I wouldn't say, had any massive glaring mistakes, again, besides that one. And I guess that's just as much as you could really hope for from two defensemen who are getting maybe like 9 to 10 minutes a night in this situation. I should also point out that both of them did actually have decent offensive chance. Clayson with a great chance, but he ends up shooting this one a mile wide, and then Milosh with a great chance off of a very, very lucky bounce off the glass, but it ends up being a big save by Gibson. But otherwise, as I said, they did decent enough in their roles for what they're going to have to do, and they'll probably won't be in the lineup for much longer, which I guess is a good thing for the Sharks. Next, I'll be talking about Knyzhov. So again, because of this injury, not only have the Sharks having to fill the void with a 5th and 6th defenseman, but the third pairing for the Sharks, which was Knyzhov and Vlasic, had to step up back into being a second pairing. And Knyzhov, it has been a very, very fast year for Knyzhov. I mean, at some point this season, he was getting just about 7 minutes. That was his lowest ice time this season in a game against the St. Louis Blues. And here tonight, he more than triples that ice time with close to 22 minutes. And it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for Knyzhov here tonight. It wasn't a spectacular game from him. There were some little bumps and bruises along the way where Knyzhov made a couple of maybe jittery type of mistakes in his game, maybe some nerves for finally being in this top 4 spot for the San Jose Sharks. But I guess all things considered, it was a pretty solid game from Knyzhov in the end, and it's been very nice to see how quickly he has managed to step into the roles that the Sharks have been giving him, rising again from that 7-minute ice time that he was getting near the start of the season to the 15 minutes he's been getting recently, and now to the 22 minutes he's managed to get because of the multiple Sharks defensive injuries thus far. And next, I'll be talking about, and finally, Marc-Edouard Vlasic. He was the other player on this pairing who had to step into a top 4 role. And Vlasic, he's certainly no stranger, unlike Knyzhov, to being in a top 4 role for the Sharks. I mean, he was a top 4 defenseman for the Sharks and at times a top 2 defenseman for the Sharks for the past 15 years or so of his career. It's only been recently that he's been demoted to this third pairing. And Vlasic, obviously, this season has been a pretty big struggle for him, but this was by far his best game of the year. He looked like prime Vlasic once again, and while I'm not going to say that this is going to be something that we're going to begin to see from Vlasic game in, game out, I do hope that that's the case, but I'm not saying that that is going to end up happening. But we should just be able to enjoy Vlasic's strong defensive game for what it was here tonight. And Booner actually ends up recognizing this because not only does Vlasic actually lead the team in ice time here tonight in terms of even strength ice time, but in the dying seconds of this third period when the Ducks are trying to get the goal to tie it up with the empty net, the open 6-on-5 chances, Booner does not end up putting on the pairing of Burns and Ferraro, but instead puts on a pairing of Burns and Vlasic. So once Carlson and once Shemek return, it'll be interesting to see where Vlasic actually finds himself in the mix, because recently he's been getting, 15, 16, 17 minutes a night, which is a pretty big drop off from where he was normally finding himself in the most of his career. But if he can continue to sustain this performance, it'll be hard to argue to not give Vlasic that few extra minutes of ice time because, again, it was his best performance of the season tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday as they'll take on the St. Louis Blues, and the Sharks will begin a stretch of games where they will face off against the Blues or the Golden Knights or against the Avalanche. So it's going to be a massive test of strength over the next couple of weeks to see where the Sharks really stack up against the cream of the crop of this division. Having said that, it should also be noted that if the Sharks end up having, which is not necessarily going to be, it wouldn't be crazy if this were to occur, if the Sharks end up putting up a pretty not so great record against these teams, for instance, if they end up only winning, let's say, 3 of the 9 or 10 games that they have, or 4 of the 9 or 10 games that they have against these teams, it's also important to not overreact in a situation like that. The Sharks are going to have to play these teams at some point, and so playing them sooner now compared to later down the line in the season is not necessarily a big deal. And so while they may at the time lose ground against the other teams like the Ducks and the Kings, it should be noted that since they're getting those games out of the way now and the Ducks and Kings aren't, that they'll have time to make up ground in the standings later on in the season when the Ducks and Kings are getting those tougher games on the schedule. So it'll be interesting to watch how the Sharks are in these next couple of weeks, but we shouldn't overreact if the performance isn't necessarily up to par. Class dismissed.